Now we've got our next speaker, and we've got a slight technology change over here. But I'll just introduce Rory. Switch microphones. So Rory, we're delighted that Rory's come to speak with us here. Hopefully that's working now. Rory's Vice Chairman of Ogilvy Group, and I guess a fervent enthusiast for behavioural economics and particularly telling stories, I guess, around behavioural economics, and hopefully he's going to share some of those with us today. We're just waiting for the tech. Hey. So I'll just hand over to Rory. Thank you very much.
Thank you. I'm not actually of your world, but I wish I was, and it's part of the marketing world that really fascinates me, partly because it gets so disproportionately little attention, considering the effects it can have. I'm always baffled by this. My background in advertising was actually in direct marketing in Ogilvy and May the Direct, as then was, starting in 1988. And what always baffled me is that all marketers say, no, we want accountability, measurability, we want to look like a science. And you look at actual marketing budgets, and they completely contradict this, because the enormous sums of money are spent on things like Olympic sponsorship, which have no clear payback model at all. And when you get to things like direct marketing or usability and so forth, where the payback is absolutely clear, measurable, and demonstrably valuable, those things actually get the most grudging and smaller part of expenditure. And I've got no real idea why this is. A little bit of it is simply that things that are expensive get a lot of senior attention because they're expensive. And there's also within client organizations a kind of self-aggrandizing factor, which is that I want to associate myself with big expensive things. Big activities like Olympic sponsorship, advertising campaigns, and that you get promoted by being attached to those things, regardless of their actual importance to the success of the firm. So once at TED I actually proposed there needed to be a new job title created in organizations, which is called Director of Detail. And it goes to a person who has immense dictatorial power, but absolutely no budget. And your job is to take care of all those little niggling things, which actually have a huge effect on a business and on a customer's own experience, but which don't cost much to fix. Because the problem is that people with power to fix things often have large budgets as well. And so they go around looking for large budget solutions, things that are appropriately expensive. And actually, the real focus should often be on entirely trivial small elements of detail. Now actually, owner-run businesses tend to be much better in this respect, generally, because the owner actually is a user and actually is highly conscious of exactly this same stuff. But it is a paradox, and I think it's very interesting. I had a friend once who left to get a job in charge of, before it went defunct for a time, email marketing for letsbuyit.com. And she left when she was desperately begging for a small photography budget for the weekly emails that went out to the email base. And this was grudging, either a small amount was grudgingly given or nothing at all. And then one day she wandered in to see her boss, and there were 6 of them, of very, very senior people, all standing around looking at their new proposed poster they were going to do. And this was receiving lavish attention and seemed sort of money no object approach. And she suddenly realized that actually the emails brought in 60 to 70% of the sales every week. And yet they were receiving none of the attention because they were considered small detail things, whereas the poster campaign, being expensive, was considered important. And this is actually the fundamental lesson. Ogilvy, what we call Ogilvy Change, which is the behavioral change and behavioral science part of Ogilvy, which we just founded. You can see our little motto is little ideas from big thinkers. And we are actually massive devotees of the little idea, the small intervention. And we suddenly realize we have a second mantra, which is dare to be trivial. And the reason we say dare to be trivial is no one wants to be trivial because it makes you... I remember when I first got promoted to the board of Ogilvy, we had this massive problem getting people to complete their timesheets. And I kept saying, look, it's very easy. 2 things. 1, pre-populate the fields and everybody will fill them out. If you don't have to look for job numbers, the likelihood that you'll fill out your timesheet is inordinately greater. And secondly, I said, if you can't do that, for God's sake, create job names, not job numbers. You know, if you're working on Project Aardvark, it's a lot easier to remember that than Project 1079B40629, which was the format we currently had. And I was looked at completely askance for making these utterly trivial suggestions. And people, meanwhile, went back to sort of incentive programs and the usual sort of neoclassical economic model of how you get people to do things. Actually, I've spent the whole morning at a Cabinet Office event at the British Academy, which is the government's behavioural insight team, and joyfully, they've come to a very similar conclusion. But actually, the most important thing about how you get people to pay tax is actually how you design the form. Now, previously, the form design for self-assessment in tax was never the attention of the permanent secretary in the department. It was delegated towards some sort of form minions, and who had no potential to change anything. If anybody at a senior level was involved, it was a lawyer whose only involvement served to make the form more complicated, unappetizing, and aesthetically repulsive. I think that chimes with most of you there. Not that it's all bad, by the way. And now they've suddenly discovered that actually very, very small changes have absolutely inordinate effects. And of course, when you're talking about the level of tax self-assessment, a tiny percentage change in both honesty and compliance has effects that are worth literally 50, 100 million pounds. And so this wonderful thing, why we say dare to be trivial, is that there's a fundamental mistake in human thinking, which comes from the fact that human behaviour is a product not of a Newtonian mechanistic system, but of a complex system. Human behaviour, and particularly mass human behaviour, are much, much closer to meteorology and chaos theory than they are to Newtonian mechanistic devices. But because the models we build of the world tend to be mechanical, Newtonian, mathematical, linear, proportionate, they tend to carry with them, these models, the assumption that there's a sort of proportionality at work, that big interventions have big effects, small interventions have small effects. Actually, in things exactly like catastrophe theory, chaos theory, meteorology, human psychology, mass psychology, utterly trivial rounding errors at the input level can have monumental effects at the output level. This is why the butterflies there. It is indeed, butterfly theory. Paul Ormerod, my friend, has written a book called Butterfly Economics, which I recommend to all of you, making the point that the standard economic models that are constructed are based on a kind of physics envy. We're desperate to try and reconstruct models of the world that obey sort of Newtonian physical laws, when the complexity of reality is that tiny things have huge effects, huge things have no effect. Very recent debate, by the way, about online pornography, just as a complete aside, but which is quite interesting. Which is that when you think about it, I don't know what the level of consumption of online porn is, but it's probably fair to say that a lot of men who never looked at pornography, maybe it's 20%, maybe it's 40%, 60% of males. I genuinely don't know, but will be now quite heavy consumers of pornography. Now, if you'd suggested 30 years ago, what we're going to do is we're actually going to go to every house in the UK and post pornographic films through the letterbox, the prediction of the effect in terms of sex crime and general sexual behaviour would have been that this would cause absolutely monumental effects. What's very interesting is that the measurement suggests that either nothing has happened, or that actually sex crimes have been mildly reduced, if to a trivial extent, by this, to all intents and purposes, monumental change. The explanation for the reduction, by the way, is attributed to something economists call the substitution effect. Presumably, if you watch Japanese pornography in which the pizza delivery man arrives and there's some lascivious conversation, then both of them are ravished by a giant sea squid, it makes you slightly less likely to dress up as a giant sea squid yourself in real life. I don't know, but it's a very, very interesting thing, because complex economics, and people like Paul Ormerod and another very interesting Australian economist at the University of Western Sydney, called Steve, I've just got his surname briefly, he's written a book called Debunking Economics. Read both of them, because they make the point that actually, something that's a product of complex systems does not behave like a physical, does not obey physical laws. And so the vital thing you're in is in exactly the right area of experimentation. Nassim Taleb, anybody familiar with the man? author of a book called The Black Swan, not the Natalie Portman thing about ballet dancing, but a book about, about how the fact that the normal distribution actually very badly depicts most things in the real world. His upcoming book is called Anti-Fragility. It's quite likely to be a bestseller. I recommend it to you in advance. It's something to pre-order. Another useful function, by the way. And one of his points is that nearly all progress is actually made through experimentation. And he accuses academics of actually stealing the credit for the product of mad inventors, experimenters, failed entrepreneurs, and people who are basically tinkering. And the reason he makes this claim is that stochastic tinkering, as he calls it, which is trying things, seeing what happens, trying again, the license to fail, which characterizes, for example, the Silicon Valley business model, produces most of the world's progress. Even in an area like the development of the jet engine, where you'd assume that theory drove the process and practice followed theory, he discovered that in the development of the jet engine, most of the progress was made by people dicking around. And why he accuses academics and theorists of stealing the credit is that when someone comes up with a really functional working jet engine, the academics and theorists come along and explain in rational language why it is that this jet engine now works better, and it's assumed by everybody that this thinking was actually the product of the improvement. But the improvement didn't arise through the application of theory. It actually arose through exactly what you people do every day. And let's face it, human nature, of course, is, by which I mean human evolution. I mean, all evolution is a product of stochastic tinkering. The really big areas, that's the best business case study there is, which is, the history of life on Earth. And it's entirely a product of that kind of process. So this book, Anti-Fragility, is a very, very interesting scientific justification for what you do. He also makes very interesting points, which I think are worth sharing with you, which is he says that most of the success of capitalism is a product of failed capitalists. That the reason you can go out and go to a restaurant and have a really pretty good chance of a pretty good meal at a reasonable price is because 7 people failed beforehand, and the final success was built to some extent on the dead bodies of those who failed. And he believes that Silicon Valley's almost encouragement of, but certainly respect for failure, is an extraordinarily important thing. And the analogy he uses is very important because we like to construct perfect narratives of our lives which suggest that, of course, I realised this long in advance, that's why I did X, and that's why I am now a wonderfully successful business person. I mean, all self-made business people have this particular narrative. Actually, Taleb makes one wonderful point. He said, to be a failed entrepreneur, we don't consider someone any less a soldier if they die in battle, and nor should we consider anyone less an entrepreneur if they fail in the attempt. I think it's a very, very important point, that actually the idea that failure is, is a terrible thing and success is something to be celebrated is an extraordinarily dangerous thing, that what you're doing through experimentation is probably the only way you can intervene in complex systems meaningfully. And this worries me, of course, about advertising, because we tend to have an assumption that, direct major linear intervention is the answer to problems. If people are doing something bad, run advertising that says, don't do this, it is bad. Quite often the successful interventions are highly oblique, they're counterintuitive, they're disproportionate. They may be very, very small. One big debate I just had at this event at the British Academy with a bunch of people is problem drinking. What happens if you introduce table service in pubs? Now, there's no direct linear relationship between serving people at a table and people getting drunk. If you take a conventional model of human behavior, all you can do is try it out and see what happens. There is, yes, you can always construct, by the way, you can always construct a plausible post-rationalization for something that succeeds, by the way, and something that fails. So be very, very wary of that as well, of the plausibility of the narrative. Because the human brain is a kind of lawyer, and it's very, very good at constructing reasons for the arbitrary. Sometimes we do it through religion, that things we can't explain we attribute to God. I would argue that actually we often misattribute luck to skill. And I find football, anybody here, I can't stand football personally, anybody agree with me? Because statistically it seems like a total nonsense, okay? That patently the scoreline in every match would be totally different if the coin toss at the beginning went differently. You can't say that about tennis, can you? Really, okay? But, football is such an arbitrary thing. Now, I think ancient Greek football commentators would have been more honest than modern football commentators. When a great goal is scored or something is messed up, in the present day we attribute it to the skill of the participants. What the ancient Greeks would have said is, United were doing very well, and then Phoebus Apollo decided to thwart their midfield efforts. Now, I would argue attributing the inexplicable to a god is actually less an act of intellectual fraud than attributing it always to the skill of the person who actually managed to luck a goal in. Does anybody else agree with me on this statistical absurdity? That basically it's pinball on grass, okay? All right? It's a series of random events on which the spectators impose a narrative entirely of their own construction, okay? But interesting. Now, by the way, I don't regard it as unacceptable as a league sport. I think if you amalgamate lots of different matches, I think you come up with a worthwhile result. But as a knockout competition sport, it's simple absurdity. There's only one sport in the world that's actually more arbitrary in the single match result than soccer. Anybody care to know? You can give your boyfriend a hard time, it's baseball. But interestingly, they don't play the World Series as one match, they play it as best of 7. So at least they're doing something there to acknowledge that a single baseball match doesn't really have a score that tells you anything about the skill level of the participants. The fact that people celebrate when they win on penalties, by the way, is insanity taken to the nth degree. Okay? I just thought I'd give you that hard time. My argument is that Richard Dawkins was completely wrong. In the UK, at least, where fundamentalist religion doesn't pose a massive, harm. Anyway, you've got a lot of people going around saying, I must be honest and helpful to other people. That's not something I regard as a huge problem to people who are religious. Dawkins' book should have been called The Football Delusion, in my opinion. But what we need to talk about here, did anybody watch this Channel 4 programme, The Undateables? And it was very interesting. There was a very early one where there was someone who had mild Asperger's syndrome who was being taken on a date. And the reason I talk about this is, to some extent, when you look at business culture today, don't worry so much about really, really good economists like Paul Ormerod or the great behavioural economists like Richard Thaler. Most people who've been to business school or studied finance, which means most people in positions of authority in a business, okay? I think 70% of the chief executives appointed since the finance crash have come from the finance function, okay? Now, most of these people have been imbued with, as anybody here doing, some of them have also, if you look at their educational background, there's a very, very high preponderance of engineers as well. Not a bad thing, by the way, because I'm conscious of my audience. But what you'll often find is that these people's assumptions about economics are based on a very, very shallow appreciation of a very mechanistic Newtonian model of how people decide, make decisions, and work. Anybody fan of Gerd Gigerenzer's book, Simple Heuristics That Make Us Smart, The Hidden Intelligence of the Unconscious? That's a really great one. Gigerenzer is an extreme guy at the Max Planck Institute in Berlin who makes the point that actually humans don't choose using mathematical optimization, they use heuristics. Anybody know what a heuristic is? You're about to find out. It's one of the most useful words. I now have a heuristic for buying books, which is if the index doesn't include the word heuristic, I don't buy the book. Which is quite useful. But one of the things in The Undateables is that if you have Asperger's in some form, you can actually perform at a very, very high mental function in lots and lots of areas. There's no particular disability, except what seems to be either lacking or underdeveloped or needing development is a basic innate empathy or understanding of how other people behave. Interestingly, some people with Asperger's can be very, very good social scientists as a result, because what we do instinctively, they have to work out for themselves. So they actually ask questions like, why do people buy those high-heeled shoes even though they must be uncomfortable? And so actually they ask questions that most people don't actually think about in the course of their lives. But what is very interesting, when this chap went out on his date, he behaved in a way that a neoclassical economist would suggest he should behave, which is that quite a nice girl, met her in a pub, sat over a table, he wasn't feeling hungry. So perfectly logically, he didn't order any food. So sat there not eating while his date had to sort of eat her chips and fish and have a drink, with him just sitting over her with no food at all. Now, most of us would instinctively, even men, I think, would instinctively realise that would weird people out a bit. We'd instinctively feel, that's not really going to work, I need to show some sort of commonality. To him, perfectly logical decision. I'm not hungry, why should I spend money on food when I'm not hungry? And there's a danger that the model of how people decide and think, which is based on the presumption of a highly rational, utility maximizing individual who's got a very, very good source of perfect information and a perfect perception of price and cost-benefit analyses and everything else, makes that decision that way. What we're starting to find is, for example, Tesco's attempts to actually upweight things by dropping price has been remarkably unsuccessful. And Nick Chater, professor at UCL, has done research on this that shows that people know only what a very small number of items in a supermarket is supposed to cost. And when they're judging whether a supermarket is expensive or cheap, they're much more likely to draw inferences from heuristics like whether the supermarket is quite swanky and has a lot of space in the aisles and stocks a lot of stuff, rather than actually looking at the prices themselves, because the second approach is simply cognitively too difficult. So heuristics are extraordinary because people look for proxy measures of things that are either difficult to measure or mathematically either intractable or complex to process. So we employ heuristics, I think, all the time. They're not, now Gigerenzer would say that they're not necessarily perfectly logical or rational, but Gigerenzer would say that they're often extraordinarily cognitively efficient. They're what he calls ecologically rational, that given the information you have available and the cost of acquiring more information, then using things like, for example, the design of the site to tell you whether it's upmarket and expensive or downmarket and cheap as a basic heuristic is, often a pretty good, a pretty good working measure. Brands really command a premium because of a heuristic. It's not that a brand is the best thing you can buy. It's that when you buy a famous name brand, it's very unlikely to be crap. Do you know what I mean? Now actually, if you look at the latest research in behavioural sciences, it shows that humans are loss averse, that we fear risk and failure and disaster and catastrophe or disappointment or regret much more than we seek perfection. I've got a few examples coming up here of something called prospect theory, which I'd like to show. But when you look at people choosing brands and paying a premium for a Panasonic television over a television by someone they've never heard of, once you understand that they're principally trying to avoid crapness rather than to attain perfection, it's called satisficing rather than maximizing, their behavior makes very good sense. Why? Because someone with an expensive and valuable reputation built up over 10 or 20 years, it is much less in their economic interest to rip you off because reputations are fragile and drop very, very fast. You feel much more comfortable buying a second-hand car from the Archbishop of York than you do from a bloke you just met in the pub. Okay? And the reason is actually perfectly sensible, that our reputation, someone with a valuable reputation in which they invest, is playing capitalism's long game of I want to be profitable through maintaining long-term, mutually beneficial, mutually advantageous, positive sum transactions with a base of loyal customers. Someone who has no name and no reputation could be playing capitalism's short game, which is the con man market trader approach, which is flog them quickly and disappear. That actually it's the reputational currency that makes capitalism work. A very interesting thing, which is if you look at it, and this is really strange when you think about it, that if you want a really bad meal, it's pretty easy. Go to a tourist restaurant. Why is that? Because they have no repeat custom, because everybody's flying back to Luton tomorrow, okay? Or Darmstadt, or wherever it is. And now, interestingly, possibly TripAdvisor might change this. But previously, if you're a tourist restaurant, your best business strategy was get as much money out of the past as you possibly can on the single occasion when they're going to visit you, in the middle of a square with a view, or whatever, and make sure they stay alive long enough to pay the bill. Those were the two approaches. So tourist restaurants tended to provide very bad food. Why? Because they had two things they didn't have to worry about. They didn't have to worry about you coming back, because however good the experience was, you probably weren't going to come back anyway. Okay? If you're in a high traffic tourist area. Okay? And the second thing is they had no real reputational damage to fear, because if you did fly back to Luton the next day, you weren't going to drive around Luton going, listen, if you ever go to Lanzarote, don't go to Pedro's restaurant down by the docks, it's rubbish, because that's of very little use to most people in Luton. If it's a Luton restaurant, you might actually spread bad vibes about the place. So the very interesting thing that actually, the use of this heuristic in reputational terms may actually be what makes capitalism work, and that if we chose rationally, we would make worse decisions for the well-being of capitalism? There's a very interesting debate here, but if you think about it, if we chose cars not by a mix of brand reputation, and brand reputation is a great piece of data compression, because it fuses word of mouth, how long the thing's been in operation, how popular it is, how famous it is. The fact that you haven't had any bad news heard about them is significant. Because if you haven't had any bad news about Pedro's restaurant in Lanzarote, that doesn't mean anything. But if you haven't heard any scare stories about a major famous brand, that probably suggests because they've basically been providing things at a good, reasonable level and not ripping off their customers. Now there's of course a huge downside to owning a brand, which is that minor damage to your reputation gets magnified many, many times. I was watching television the other day and there was a report on Sky News about a small food poisoning outbreak in a McDonald's in Chicago. Now why the hell they got on Sky? Now if you think about it, if that had been an independent restaurant in Chicago, it wouldn't even got onto the local news. When it's a McDonald's, it gets onto the international news. So there's a massive fragility to owning a brand. But interestingly, it's that precise fragility that makes people feel they can trust them. And so to a great extent, it's a very interesting heuristic because it isn't rational, but it's highly intelligent. And that, I think, that Giger owns a phrase, the hidden intelligence of the unconscious, is always something, before you divide the world into rational and irrational, remember that there are things that are rational and stupid, what I call stodgic, which is they're rationally sensible, they won't get you fired, but they actually have quite bad results. And there are also things that are irrational, they're difficult to defend and difficult to justify, but they actually have a hidden intelligence once you delve into them. And so one of the things I urge any community involved in experimentation is you must earn a relationship with people around you that allows you to test things that are not logical, because they may work. And the danger is that because this business idea of neoclassical economics and perfectly rational individuals, and that even if people aren't rational, they should be. Because economics has become a kind of prescriptive science. It permeates a lot of the business world. Your finance directors feel that they should win by reducing price, increasing value, and they regard perceptual things as something you shouldn't really talk about. You know, it's just people being stupid. Okay? They then leave work and go and play golf for 4 hours. So proving that they're not quite as rational as they claim to be, since I can think of better use of your time than propelling a very small ball around a complex course of obstacles using implements entirely ill-suited to the purpose. But this is the great point. Now, a few people have spotted this. Hayek spotted, in his 1972 Nobel Prize acceptance speech, he spotted this physics envy. It's assumed in physics that any important factor which determines the observed events will be itself directly observable and measurable. In the study of such complex phenomena as the market, however, which depend on the actions of many individuals, all the circumstances which will determine the outcome of a process will hardly ever be fully known or measurable. And he went on to say that while in physics, the investigator will be able to measure what, on the basis of a prima facie theory he thinks important, volume, pressure, temperature, all those kind of things. They're all susceptible to numerical measurement. In the social sciences, often that is treated as important, which happens to be accessible to measurement. Now, just to explain this, you all know this one, I've told this story so many times, but people get disappointed if I don't. The best way, apparently, to spend £6 billion improving the Eurostar experience was to make the journey shorter, because speed, duration, utilisation of rolling stock are all numerical measures. Okay? Now, if you'd given the marketing department £6 billion and said improve the experience, Wi-Fi on the train would have cost 0.01% of that total amount and would probably have actually added more enjoyment or utility to the journey than making it a bit shorter. Kahneman also makes out the point that the remembering self has a very poor perception of duration anyway. I gave this talk and a chap came up to me afterwards and said, I used to be the chief executive of Eurostar. Shit! Beat me up. He then said, no, I resigned over the issue. He said, because we were already beating the only competition that mattered in preference, which was airlines. The reason people preferred to go by train was either because the train goes from the middle of the city to the middle of the city, and they wanted to get to the middle of the city, or that a train journey just involves more sitting on your arse looking out of the window and less dicking around than a short-haul flight. Okay? There are huge amounts of irritation around a short-haul flight that aren't factored into the 55 minutes flight duration. I also made the point that you could employ all of the world's top male and female supermodels for £1 billion, get them to walk up and down the train handing out free chateau patrons to all the passengers. you'd still have £5 billion left over, and people would ask for the trains to be slowed down. There are lots of ways, but because you're required to justify everything in nerd world, in accountancy world, with a numerical model involving spreadsheets, things that are really important to humans but not numerically expressible, like comfort, enjoyment, pleasure, cheap thrills, perviness. I mean, lots of those things that are hugely important to people. There is no economic justification either for playing golf or for popping bubble wrap. But there are immensely appealing things to do. And so that danger that we always look at things that are numerically accessible, whereas things that are just get factored out, is a problem, because actually our inner brain is deeply concerned. It has basically 2 meters running consistently: approach, withdraw, enjoy, dislike. And those things are more or less constantly running. So very mild irritations which just flip the lever just for a second into the yuck quadrant, something like a site that's a bit slow to load, have a totally disproportionate effect because we're constantly measuring those particular things. Now, just to give you another interesting example, the neoclassical economic model is psychologically blind. It treats people as if they're calculating computers. It's ethically blind. It doesn't make a distinction between, so actually just says if it's legal, it's okay. Now, consumers are not ethically blind and actually do care about where the money goes. To an economist, giving £5 to charity and giving £5 to an arms dealer are virtually the same activity because you lose £5 in both cases. And I've had an interesting debate about things like how you pay for express lanes at passport control. Should you? There's an ethical debate, by the way, about whether you should be able to pay for faster passport processing at Heathrow anyway. Michael Mandel of Harvard's written a book called What Money Can't Buy about this issue. My issue is that there's a fundamental difference if the £5, because let's face it, you may have a very tight connection and just may need to get through very quickly. There's a very big difference in my view if the £5 goes to Oxfam for jumping the queue versus if the £5 goes to the British Airports Authority. Those would be fundamentally different propositions to me, but to an economist they'd be basically identical. It sacrifices human concerns to mathematical neatness. Anything that doesn't fit into a spreadsheet it pretends doesn't exist. It's less honest than religion in that respect. It's entirely individualistic. So the whole model of economics depends on people making individualistic decisions that are unaffected by the behaviour of other people. Now, that's a hugely dangerous thing in most areas of, patently in fashion, for example, in clothing. You don't operate within a vacuum. It would be theoretically possible for me to live my entire life wearing 16th century court dress. I might find it comfortable and warm and pleasant, but the basic social costs of extreme costume deviance. I'll give you a very small example. I think those Android tablets on an individual level are slightly better than the iPad. Okay? And I bought an Android tablet, and I love it like a child, but it has one massive disadvantage versus the iPad. Does anybody know? Every time you take it out, you have to explain to someone why you didn't buy an iPad. I actually prefer, because I'm a deviant, I prefer Dr. Pepper to Coke. Okay? But Coke has a magical property as a drink, which has nothing to do with the drink itself. It's the only drink in the world where you can ask for it, it's the only cold non-alcoholic drink in the world where you can ask for it absolutely everywhere, and if they haven't got it, it's their fault, not yours. Okay, so you can ask for a Coke with no fear of embarrassment or rebuff, anywhere you go. If I ask for Dr. Pepper, they will reply, no, we don't stock it, brackets, unspoken, idiot. Okay? So unless there's a huge sign up saying, we sell Dr. Pepper, I will be unable to purchase the drink. I'm unwilling to purchase the drink, even though I prefer it, and despite the absence of any scientific supporting evidence, believe the drink contains actual medicinal powers. But it dominates business thinking because engineers, accountants, people who've done MBAs, who've just done Economics 101, believe the world works this way. They believe that if you drop the price of something, demand will go up, invariably. Now, anybody in the luxury goods sector knows that's bonkers to start with. It's actually probably the most you could say about that, which economists regard as a law, just as they regard non-satiety as a law, transference of preference as a law. I would say it's probably true more often than it is not. Okay? They also believe that all price demand curves are curves. What complexity theory economists and econophysicists now believe is that you can have multiple peaks to a price demand curve, so you can profit maximize at two completely different points. So the idea that the whole relationship is as neat as they believe is fundamentally wrong. But this model dominates business decision making. Why that's difficult and dangerous is because models are good. Models are good when they're an aid to thinking. But the danger with all models is they stop being an aid to thinking and become a substitute for thinking. And so people go, well, we don't need to think about any of this because we know what will happen if we drop our prices, more people will buy. And actually, if you read a book by Steve Keen on debunking economics, even that most basic tenet of economics is fundamentally wrong. But as I said, it causes people to think we don't need to think about this. Now, the domination, by the way, of numerical measures over anything else, the really great thing about travelling by train versus travelling short-haul air is you get a really big table. And you can put a laptop and a cup of coffee and a newspaper and stuff on the table and basically get on with some work on the Eurostar. Okay? But you're not allowed to put measures like tableness into your case for the Eurostar. Everything has to be about speed, duration, rolling stock utilization. I asked someone from our clients, British Airways, for whom we do quite a bit of work on this area, said, when you made the case for Terminal 5, how did you make the hedonic case, which is lots of people who previously couldn't be bothered to travel to Heathrow, I live in Kent, for example, when it was crappy old Terminal 4, will actually be prepared to spend an extra 25 minutes on the motorway if you've got basically blue water with planes, okay? Sorry, I come from Kent, which reveals why I regard blue water as like the height of all possible cultural achievement. Sorry about that one. But the point is that they said we weren't allowed to factor that in at all. What? No. You could use speed of luggage processing. You could use retail sales. That was allowed. That was the only human measure that was allowed. You could allow speed of processing, turnaround of aircraft, numerical accountancy things. The fact that Terminal 5 was nice, whereas Terminal 4 was a bit shit, was not allowed to be factored into any business case to support. So human happiness is not allowed to factor in business decision making, basically. Now, to disprove this, how many people have used this thing? How many people derive an insane and pervy degree of pleasure from riding in these driverless pods and will admit to it? It's very interesting because quite often it's not much cheaper than the short stay, is it? Really, it's only a few quid. And it's actually about 7 minutes further away from the airport. It's called the business car park at Heathrow Terminal 5. And you press a button, one of these pods, and you can travel on your own. It's not like public transport or anything else like that. You travel on your own or in your family in the pod, and it drives you to the airport or to the half of the car park which you like in a little James Bond style driverless pod. Okay? Now what's interesting about that is very few people would admit this. But quite often when you get to the business car park, it's full because so many people enjoy riding on these pods. And they tell you, well, because the business car park's full, you can have a free upgrade to short stay and park there for the same price. And people go, but I won't get to ride in the pod. Human behaviour is inordinately determined by subconscious pleasures and feelings to which we don't always have conscious access. Now, this is Taleb just saying that this is science, this is real life, that to use the models of physics to explain what happens in real life is bogus. Marketing hasn't helped itself, by the way, in dealing with rational people. It's 80 years old. The model is appalling, really. It's got no links with any recognisable science. It's also got the worst vocabulary imaginable, marketing. Because it's a vocabulary which, first of all, it's like, as a friend of mine said, it's like the vocabulary of astrology, which is if you're talking to fellow believers, i.e. fellow marketing enthusiasts, it sounds fine. My brother knows this, he's a professional astronomer, and the worst thing that happened to my brother before he got married was you go to parties and some quite attractive girl will come up to you and say, so what do? I'm an astronomer. To which you go, that's great, I'm a Sagittarius. Okay? This was his nightmare every time. And it is like the language of astrology. If you're a fellow believer, you can have conversations like that's typically Capricorn. Okay? But if you're talking to someone who doesn't believe fundamentally in marketing, i.e. the finance director, it makes you sound like a total loon. Okay? So talking to your finance director about brand iconography is like going to the head of thoracic surgery at St Mary's Hospital, Paddington, and saying, you must trust to the healing power of the crystal. Okay? It's got whack job vocabulary, and it isn't scientific. The other problem is, because the vocabulary is very weird and complex, people like finance guys. One of the great things about working in marketing is, particularly in the advertising world, is you've got a license to be a bit stupid. No one minds if you suggest stupid things. That's the culture you have to have in an ad agency. In a finance department, suggesting one stupid thing basically destroys your career path forever. And so creating a vocabulary which poses many, many pitfalls for the finance community or the highly rational business and board community means I don't want to get involved with that shit because I might end up looking stupid. And so the very involvement from those people we actually need in order to get adequate funding is actually destroyed by vocabulary. Now there is happily a new school of science which will help us fight back. The first person is a man called Daniel Kahneman. His book is now number 5 in the bestseller chart in the UK called Thinking Fast and Slow. He won the Nobel Prize for Economics in 2002. What's odd about that is he's not an economist. He's the first non-economist to win a Nobel Prize for Economics. He's a psychologist. And his work is in showing how actual human behaviour differs markedly from the behaviour posited by neoclassical economic theory. There are also wonderful psychological effects which show that consumers can't actually separate. If you ask people to rationally measure things for attractiveness, speed, loading speed, etc., we think that our conscious perception can make this distinction. The reality is that our brains, before anything reaches our consciousness, a huge amount of data compression goes on. Be very careful. Actually, our own perception, there's a lot of data compression going on. We may confuse the speed of a site load with, its aesthetics. We don't genuinely, the idea that we can actually disentangle all the different components of something and judge them dispassionately is a dangerous one. We may not be able to do that. There's some evidence, for example, that painkillers, if they're branded, are much more effective at relieving pain than if they're unbranded. And that isn't just through reported pain.
In the illusion,
biasing effect, you actually put electrodes in people's heads, see how much pain they're experiencing, and the Panadol will do a lot better.
We look at a face can actually
Simply if you tell people
what we
pain
believe
is very
we're hearing.
expensive,
If we close our eyes, we actually hear the sound
So
of
the
the
idea that
face.
we have this
If we open
perfect
our eyes,
rational
we actually
conscious brain
see
that
how the mouth
disentangle
movements can influence what we're
is
hearing.
dubious in itself. The best model of the brain, actually, Kahneman calls it System 1 and System 2. It's a very, very useful model. I like his terminology because it's judgment neutral, it's value neutral. Jonathan Haidt, the University of Virginia psychologist, describes the human brain as a man sitting on an elephant. The man on the elephant is our conscious brain. Who dominates our consciousness, it's capable of sort of rational thought to a degree.
The effect works no matter how much you know about the effect. I've been studying the McGurk effect for 25
Most of our
years
processes,
now.
which we share with all animals,
Been
are
the patient in the stimuli, I've seen stimuli thousands and thousands of times.
The distinction between System 1 and System 2 is if I say 2 plus 2, all of you think
Each brain just takes
without
that
any mental
information and
effort
doesn't
being
care
required.
about what
It's
outside
just an
knowledge can bring
instinctive
to bear.
response. If I say what's 27 times 48, all of you will suddenly have to start puzzling and your head will hurt a bit. Okay? Those are the two systems. But the point is that System 2 is not perfect. It's frankly in beta. It can only process about 50 bits of information a second, whereas the elephant can process 50 megabytes of information. Quite a lot of the information referred to the bloke is actually probably already compressed, and the attention of the bloke is to some extent determined by which direction the elephant is pointing. Okay? The other point is that in terms of human decision making, as Haidt puts it, the man can occasionally intervene to nudge the elephant, to direct its attention left or right, to occasionally encourage it or make attempts at restraint. It might be able to train the elephant a bit, but if the elephant doesn't want to do something, there's no way in hell that the man on top can get the elephant to do it. So if something instinctively feels wrong, there is no rational process that can actually override basically what is instinctive revulsion. Now, the problem is that we tend to, because market research talks to the System 2, it talks to the rider, and the rider, by the way, is delusional. It has massive powers of self-delusion, of narrative bias. As one guy, I think Carmen puts it, it thinks it's the Oval Office, whereas in reality it's the press office. It thinks it's actually making the decisions, when in reality most of the time the elephant makes the decisions and it constructs hasty stories to make sense of what's actually happened. That actually, to an extent, our attitudes are a product of our behaviour rather than the other way around. Paul Dolan and I came up with this. Sorry, and I'm really sorry about this, and I'm going to lose my job over this sort of slightly smutty analogy one day. Well, there we go, we live dangerously, which is that our phrase is that when a man says, my wife doesn't understand me, it doesn't mean he's planning an affair, it means he's already had one. Okay? Well, the logic of that is that the conventional model of human decision making is kind of, we act as kind of McKinsey brain. And we go, I measure my wife on a balanced scorecard every quarter, and if I notice declining empathy levels, I decide to outsource a range of sexual services to competing providers, which is the kind of McKinsey model of how you should have a relationship. Okay? What actually happens, the bloke gets drunk at a party, ends up snogging somebody he doesn't even really fancy very much, and going home later as a desperate attempt to make sense of his actions and construct a story in which he comes out well, he constructs an entirely bogus case against his wife. Okay? Now, I know it's a funny analogy, but it's kind of being aware that an awful lot of human behavior is like that sunk cost bias requires us to arrive at points of view which are, you know, basically insane, but simply make sense of whatever condition we find ourselves in, is an important insight, I think, into the human condition. So that's why I tell the story. But the vital thing is that the software you write for talking to two and talking to one, the elephant is a different operating system and it runs on different software. And quite often when we use rational persuasion and argument, we're effectively writing software for the wrong operating system. We're trying to use, does anybody here ever won an rational argument? If you ever actually sat up at 11 o'clock at night and someone says, no, I've been a lifelong Labour supporter, but listening to what you just said, I realise I've been wrong all my life. It really doesn't happen very much. You can nudge and you can reframe arguments, so you can get people to look at things in a different way. But direct intellectual confrontation is an incredibly bad way of actually changing a person's behaviour or point of view. And the software, how you write software for System 1 is fundamentally different. The software that System 1 runs on seems to be heuristics. How do you catch a cricket ball, a high-flying cricket ball or baseball if you're American? You don't perform mathematical equations. To do that, you need to know the velocity of the ball when it left the bat, the effect of air resistance, the angle of travel, the effect of gravity, and about 6 other variables, and perform incredibly complicated equations. Now, it's fair to say that the best cricketers are also theoretical physicists, okay, generally. What they actually do, and they don't know they do it, this is what's interesting about heuristics, that we operate many of them beneath the level of consciousness. The only way they've been able to find out how cricketers catch balls is through observation. They found that the dogs catch frisbees exactly the same way, using the same heuristic. You look up at the ball, calculate the angle of gaze, and move towards the ball at whatever speed keeps that angle of gaze constant. Okay? It's slightly suboptimal because it causes you to move in a very slight arc. But it's incredibly ecologically rational, and you can actually, first of all, you're solving the problem while you're moving towards the ball. You're not sitting there with a scientific calculator as the ball travels 100 yards in the other direction. If you want another example of a guy employing a brilliant heuristic, there's this one. Here we go. Oh, sorry, I'll press it back.
Do you want to try to go to Peterborough? Yes. Peterborough, Empire, actually, we're going to Park Guy Emergency inbound. Hey, guys. Captain 1529 of the George Washington Bridge wants to go to the airport right now. Whatsoever, I'll check. Does he need assistance? Yes, the bird strike. Can I get him in for runway 1? Runway 1, that's good. Captain 1529, turn right 280 to land runway 1 is Peterborough. We can't do it. Okay, which runway would you like at Peterborough? We're going to be that one.
His last words there are, we're going to be in the house. I think this is a bloke thing. My wife goes bananas when I listen to live, cockpit voice things from air results. I think it's a bit of a blokey thing, to be absolutely honest, okay? So I apologise. That's the Miracle on the Hudson, and that's the pilot, a guy called Chesley V. Sullenberger. And what's interesting about that is he's off at Teterboro Airport, over to the right in New Jersey. There's about 10 seconds while the guy clears Teterboro for an emergency landing. Goes back to the pilot, he says, we can't do it. Well, where do you want to go? We're going to be in the Hudson. Now, what the pilot, who interestingly was an amateur glider pilot in his spare time, he was a glider pilot there, effectively, he was both in and out, but he was a glider pilot in his spare time. What he didn't do was go, what is my altitude, what is the difference to Teterboro Airport, what is my rate of descent, and then perform mathematical calculations on the feasibility of reaching Teterboro. He couldn't have done it in the time available. So what he did is a very common glider pilot heuristic, by the way, is if you want to know where you can land, you put the plane into as low a rate of descent as you can feasibly manage. You look forwards out of the window, all the land that's moving up in your field of vision is a place you can't reach, everywhere that's moving down in your field of vision is a place where you can't. And jolly good, this guy used a heuristic rather than actually resorting to mathematical calculation. Because nobody died, in fact, barely anybody was injured. and he made a very, very good decision.
Okay, which one would you like a Teterboro?
They tried to replicate what he did, by the way, using flight simulators, and most of the people crash in attempting to return to the original airport. If you assume a 30-second delay for working out what the hell's going on with the engines, nobody makes it back safely to Newark, for example. And the interesting thing is, first of all, that we don't know the heuristics we use. They're often beneath our consciousness, which is why behavioural research, such as usability testing, is often the only way you can do it, because people are actually using devices and choice mechanisms, choosing mechanisms and stopping rules and things like this, which are all in the science of choice science, decision science, and they're using them without being aware that they're using them. Exactly as Sutherland may have known that he was doing that. He's an extraordinarily well-read, obsessive bloke, obsessed with aircraft safety. But most pilots, one hopes, would have done it instinctively. There's a debate that when you automate cockpits to too great an extent, pilots lose some of the instinctive feel for the behaviour of an aircraft, and that they actually become technically better, but instinctively worse. So that's a vital argument in favour of testing, that you can't research these things because, as David Ogilvy said, people don't think what they feel, they don't say what they think, and they don't do what they say. Here's a case of actually writing to System 1, talking to the elephant. Frederick the Great wanted the Germans, the Prussians particularly, to grow potatoes, because if they had potatoes and wheat, two crops, the likelihood of a bad famine killing off the population or creating huge volatility in food pricing could be reduced by the substitution effect I mentioned earlier in the context of corn. The interesting thing there is that he tried persuasion, he tried rational incentives, he tried rational argument, he even tried punitive measures for people who wouldn't grow potatoes. They all failed. So he tried talking to System 1. System 1 has one very powerful bias, which is scarcity bias. You all know only 4 seats left at this price, right? Do you do that, by the way, do you do that on Bowden?
Not as yet.
Not as yet. Only 2 left at this price, even when I know everything. I know exactly what's being done to me. I've read all about scarcity bias. It still works on me. It's like the McGurk effect. Oh shit, I must book those seats. I don't know whether the next price is going to be 10 pence more. They could even be lying, to be absolutely honest, although you wouldn't do that, obviously. But only X left at this price, because scarcity bias is an innate human instinct, which is just in System 1, and colours off the instinct before it even reaches our consciousness. So what Frederick the Great did is he declared that the potato was a royal vegetable, that only members of the royal family were allowed to eat it. He planted a royal potato patch outside his palace, and he had it guarded night and day with secret instructions to the guards not to guard it very well. If you tell an 18th century peasant that this food's too good for the likes of you, they want to nick it. And sure enough, they did. That's a case of talking to System 1 rather than attempting to talk to System 2. Scarcity bias, only 4 left at this price. Obviously, social proof, such as 7 people are currently browsing this page, that kind of thing just works. There's a very interesting problem actually in supermarkets, which doesn't apply so much in mail order, which is you have an interesting conflict, which is that social proof means you should have enormous facings on the shelf. But if you want something to look scarce, you want smaller facings. The size thing wins out. You can actually deploy both of them in the same direction on a website in a way that you can't on a supermarket. Walkers, by the way, the reason they created all these flavours, 70% of people just buy salt and vinegar, cheese and onion and plain crisps. Walkers realised that crisp buying was moving from the corner shop to the supermarket, and they created a whole load of slightly gratuitous flavours, partly just to create noise in the marketplace, but partly because it meant that the Walkers section of the supermarket shelf of the multi-packs was 4 times bigger than the Golden Wonder one. And consumers, without even knowing it, go, fuck me, they're obviously, without even knowing it, they go, shit, there's 8 feet of Walkers, there's 2 feet of Golden Wonder, that must actually tell me something, I'll buy some Walkers crisps. And that effect actually works even if you're basically aware of it. It's one of those McGurk colouring effects. I'd better skip some of this, except to say that, actually, let me very quickly, I've got 2 minutes left. Okay, what's the most valuable thing I can talk about in 2 minutes? First of all, there are wonderful behavioural solutions to problems I think we can actually solve if we break away from this neoclassical economic model of the rational individual. I'm trying to get medical people to say, if you want people to complete their course of antibiotics, don't give them 26 white pills, give them 18 white pills and 8 blue ones. And say, when you finish the white pills, take the blue ones. If you have any kind of milestone in a course of action, you're much more likely to complete the whole course of action than if it's undifferentiated. The software loading bar is, of course, a fantastic instinct, which is, if there's some sign of progress, we'll wait for 3 hours to download software. If you click on a link and nothing happens, after 3 seconds you go, stuff this for a game of soldiers, and you go somewhere else. The extent to which actually things like loading speed of pages and things may act on us unconsciously and may be used as proxies for product quality and everything else, without us being aware of it, is another great reason why you have to experiment under really, really good conditions. Because we don't know what affects our decision making. The system 2 thinks it does, but actually the reality is it doesn't. I'll skip that, but very quickly I'll just move on to this, this very quick point. This is an interesting one. This is a fundamental philosophical point from A.N. Whitehead, the 19th century philosopher, mathematician, and genius, actually. It's a profoundly erroneous truism. This is how we should differentially use system 2. We should reserve our system 2 for things that really matter and are worth protracted abstract thought. And Whitehead's point, civilization advances by extending the number of important operations that we can perform without thinking about them. There's a huge virtue to designing any human experience where actually you can perform most of the tasks instinctively without cognitive engagement. The extent to which people can almost do it habitually and without thinking and predictably is of enormous, this is actually of philosophical importance to an extent. We should reserve our mental effort for times when it pays off. The rest of the thing should require as little mental engagement as possible. And so when you get people making decisions almost unthinkingly, that's actually a triumph in ethics. I've mentioned these things already. Very interesting questions about how you present information has a huge effect on how people decide. One of the things I'd like to start a battle against is APR as a measure of interest. Because the APR measure, first of all, it makes debt look cheaper than it is and saving look less advantageous than it is because it hides the compounding effect. Now, I think if you are selling financial products to system 1, not system 2, you wouldn't say 3.3% APR, 4.9% APR. You'd say double your money in 13 years. If you think about it, a 2-for-1 is a system 1 offer, 15% off is slightly a system 2 offer. That if you can couch anything in terms which are system 1 accessible and meaningful, and to some extent the job of an advertising agency is as a translation agency, to translate a client's system 2 objectives into system 1 language. To actually convey statistics and information in a way that actually is meaningful to system 1 is an act of translation and in many ways is an imaginative act. And so that sort of thing strikes me as actually really important. But the APR system is, of course, designed by finance people and lawyers, and it covers their ask. There are huge questions I'll ask. One of them is about, actually this is quite a good fundamental question on which to end before I just go to one more point. We have the brief. This is the difference between rationality and logic and intelligence, and they're not the same thing. And there's a fundamental asymmetry within business, which is all creative and imaginative people and experimenters and wacky people are heavily policed by logical people. And that's probably a good thing. You don't want the marketing department to take over the organization to a point of insanity. What's really significant though is that the same does not apply the other way around. When rational people come up with a rational argument, they don't say, well, the answer appears to be 3.89, but before I present that to the board, I'm going to show my findings to some really wacky people to see if they can look at it differently. So there is this fundamental asymmetry within most business cultures, which is, broadly speaking, you can be fired for being illogical, but you can't be fired for being unimaginative. If you do something that's logical but unimaginative, your job's safe. In the civil service, of course, you're promoted to almost unimaginable heights. So the vital thing here is, let's look at a very interesting issue, which is why I call God the first behavioural economist. The French wanted to do a thing which was the working time directive, limiting hours to 35 hours a week. It's incredibly difficult to police, it's very hard to spot people who are breaking it, it's very cognitively difficult to keep track of how many hours you work in a week. God had the same problem. He created something called the Sabbath. On the 7th day you rest. You could spot people who are Sabbath breaking. Religious law, if you look at it, is often non-logical but highly intelligent. Now let's look at another case. We work with DrinkAware. How do you tell people to limit their drinking so that it doesn't become a problem? You do a whole load of epidemiological studies. It says that people who drink 28 units a week or less, or fewer, generally don't come to much harm. So you make a recommendation saying don't drink more than 28 units a week. And you've done your job as a government scientist. You're unlikely to get fired because your recommendation is entirely logical. in behavioural human terms, your recommendation is a bit rubbish, to be honest. A non-rational but more effective recommendation might be don't drink on 3 days a week. Okay? That's, if you look at religion, it doesn't fast. Sorry, people in religion don't diet, they fast. The instructions are binary. How often do we break the speed limit? Most of the time we drive, I would argue. By the way, when I first moved to London from the countryside, I didn't realise there was a speed limit in London. Yeah. I just assumed that in London you drove as fast as you could under the circumstances. And I used to drive down the North Courage Drive in Hyde Park at 70 miles an hour, unaware that I was doing anything wrong. That was, by the way, I'm an idiot. But no, well, that's true. But we break the speed limit most of the time we drive. How often do you run a red light? Even at 3 o'clock in the morning when there's nowhere around? Probably once a year, deliberately, I mean, probably once a year. Breaking binary instructions affects us in System 1 in a different way than quantitative instructions. Binary thing. So don't drink on 3 days a week. First of all, you can decide in advance when you're going to drink and when you're not going to drink. Restricting yourself to units requires you to stop drinking when you're already drunk. How difficult is that? The practice of self-deception in unit counting is immense. So you can basically convince yourself that litre bucket of Chilean Merlot, 14.9%, is a single unit. Okay? When in reality it's about 4. Okay? Making the rule don't drink on 3 days a week is also, can be socially self-reinforcing. If your friends pick the same days, you can all go out and do non-drinky things on Monday, Wednesday and Thursday. If your wife or husband or partner, again, has the same days as you, the other thing is your wife or partner can police you a bit without being a nut, okay? Now, my wife would say, don't forget, if you drink tomorrow, you won't be able to drink on Thursday. I think that's reasonable, that's fine. Now, if my wife wants to police my units, now unless she actually works for the Stasi, and I'm kind of, that's like Max Mosley and actually enjoy being humiliated by women with German accents, you know. So you have to go, so, how many units do you have today? Right, this is 7.3. This means, and then effectively, it requires policing each other and mutual help requires a degree of intrusion and policing that most people would find utterly intolerable. Now, there are also interesting schools of thought in the dietary world, which is to say that both fasting and not eating carbohydrates at all is an easier way to diet and lose weight than constant calorie restriction. Because constant calorie restriction imposes constant demands on the System 2 brain. Every time you have a meal, you have to have a meal that's smaller than the meal that you want to have. Okay? Now, that's a bit like trying to give up sex by going to lap dancing clubs instead, if you know what I mean. Giving yourself slightly less of what you want is an absurd way to try and limit your behaviour. Whereas actually saying, you know, if you say, I'm not going to eat any sugars or carbohydrates, you can shop for them once a week, don't buy any carbohydrates, not much danger that you eat them because there aren't any in the house. Okay? So the interesting thing is, to what extent should we design things? If you design things in behavioural terms, it's a fundamentally different thing to designing things in logical terms. So there's stodging, which is the unit thing. It's rational and logical, but not very effective, arguably. And there's also what you might call hidden intelligence, which is apparently illogical. You could theoretically not drink 3 days a week, and you're a raging alcoholic on the other 4 days. You're going around generally swearing at people and crashing your car. And there are other examples. The 3-day-a-week thing is good because it gives you an early warning signal. If you have difficulty not drinking for a day, you know, you probably should look at things. Okay, without getting too sanctimonious. Now, final very interesting thing, prospect theory, emergent behavioural economics. This is how human decision-making in one very significant way differs from that posited by rational economic theorists. By the way, anybody who's what deal or no deal knows exactly the same thing. Deal or no deal, played by economists, would be very, very boring. They just calculate the banker's offer as a ratio of expected return and either say yes or no depending on the offer. What, of course, economics is blind to is regret. If you've had the chance of 40,000 quid and you go home with 50p, you feel like an idiot for the rest of your life and everybody in the pub calls you Loser Dave. Okay? Now, here's a question for all of you, it's just fun. Which do you prefer, a 50% chance of winning $500,000 or a 51% chance of winning $470,000? Now, most of you will actually say, well, you know, in that case, it's only 1% more, but I get, in that case, actually, people often take quite different decisions in the second case. People will take a very, very big sacrifice in exchange for certainty and confidence. So most people will sacrifice $30,000 for a 1% extra chance of winning money if it's the difference between 99% and 100. But they won't make the same sacrifice if it's the difference between 50% and 51. So I'll end with a very interesting bit of question, which is, do brands make money because people pay a very big certainty premium? Here are two chances. This is actually a Chinese brand of television you've never heard of. Rixin, 4% chance of being crap, £299.99. Philips, 0.1% chance of being crap. That's vastly more expensive. Now, I think most of us, when making that decision, actually don't factor in those percentages in a way that someone working in procurement might. Actually, someone in procurement will buy really shit television for $50 probably. Just teasing. Okay. But the final thing is, here's a very final thing. In an economically rational universe, confidence and certainty is of enormous importance to psychology. And we will pay an enormous premium for the feeling of certainty. Now, here is just a pair of Ray-Ban sunglasses sold on eBay. I just took two at random. I looked for someone with about a 98% approval rating. Looked for a reasonably equivalent. Now, there are huge studies have been done, but these are just Google Images pictures, screen dubs. He's asking £32.99 for those sunglasses. And one of them, now this guy's got a 100% feedback rating, and he's asking £109.99. Now, if you were totally rational, I don't know, how many of you buy on eBay? Okay, if you were totally rational, you do the maths and go, well, there's only a... Now, actually, let's be honest, someone with a 98.8% feedback rating is probably more unreliable than the figure suggests. But let's say he's 5% unreliable. You go, well, you know, those sunglasses are a third the price, and he's only got a 5% chance of being unreliable. So mathematically, that's a no-brainer. Got it? And we should all go, well, it's a brilliant trade-off, that. Most people do not do that maths. They go, there's no way I'm buying from that chap, he might rip me off. So the extraordinary premium we'll pay for the difference between probably and certainly, and the extraordinary effect even very small elements of doubt have on our willingness to pay, seems to me one of the great insights in behavioral sciences. There's probably a reason for it, which is that evolution has taught us to be risk averse and to actually see potential costs and risks twice as acutely as benefits, simply because to survive, it pays to be cautious. You're real optimists, wow, lions, aren't they brilliant? Okay, tempted to get eaten and not to reproduce very much. So probably evolutionary reasons there, but that seems to me as one of the central insights of the behavioural sciences. It's a wonderful thing. Buy the books, Thinking Fast and Slow by Daniel Kahneman, Gigerenz's book. By the way, Gigerenz and Kahneman can't stand each other. That's academics, okay? But Gigerenz's book on the hidden intelligence of the unconscious. If for nothing else, it will give you a great vocabulary. And the other thing is, don't expect a theory of everything. There isn't one, any more than anybody's going to crack meteorology, okay? It's too complicated, it's mathematically intractable even with a supercomputer, okay? All you can do is what chess players do, use pattern recognition. But if you have the framework of behavioral economics, it gives you a kind of mug tree on which to hang your findings. Now, there may be 30 or 40 generalizations you can make from behavioral economics. Maybe 20 or 30 of those will carry 95% of the findings. But nonetheless, having a kind of mental mug tree on which you go, ooh, people here seem to be looking at affected by scarcity bias, people over here seem to be affected by prospect theory, is just a really useful thing because you've got a mental map on which to keep your discoveries and a vocabulary with which you can talk not only to marketers, but you can also talk to finance. So I hope that helps, and thank you very much indeed.